This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to sign up using the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Last week, the Biden administration announced that any US citizen working in China's semiconductor industry would be in violation of America's Export Administration regulations, and could therefore face up to 20 years in prison and as much as $1 million in fines per criminal violation. This triggered a massive wave of resignations across the industry, significantly reducing China's domestic manufacturing capability and provoking an angry response from Chinese authorities. So, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at these new export controls, what motivated them, and how the Chinese might respond. So, before we get into the most recent developments, a bit of context. As you might already know, semiconductors are an essential component of basically any electronic device you can think of. At the moment, the US is the big player when it comes to designing semiconductors, and Taiwan is the big player when it comes to producing them. Somewhere between 50 and 70% of the world's microchips, and something like 95% of the world's advanced microchips, are produced by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which has most of its factories on the Taiwanese mainland. Most of these semiconductors are exported to China, which, as the world's factory, accounts for something like 50% of all demand worldwide. While there are a couple of Chinese companies involved in manufacturing, China still imports about 70% of all of its semiconductors. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the CCP don't like this. They think that China's reliance on imports when it comes to semiconductors, which are an essential part of any modern economy, make it vulnerable to foreign interference. This is a common theme in Chinese foreign policy. The CCP have spent a lot of time worrying about the so-called Malacca dilemma, which refers to the fact that about 70% of China's oil imports are shipped via the Strait of Malacca and could therefore be easily cut off by any foreign power with control over the strait. This is why, in 2015, the Made in China 2025 plan was unveiled, which essentially aims to make China self-sufficient in all strategically important industries, including semiconductors. This basically involves directing a ton of money towards companies like China's Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation and Shaojin via the National Integrated Circuits Industry Investment Fund. Now, we should say here that total self-sufficiency is probably impossible. Advanced semiconductors and the technology required to produce them are just too complicated for any one country to do all of it themselves at a competitive cost. Nonetheless, China has made significant progress in mitigating its foreign dependence. While it's still behind industry leaders like TSMC, SMIC has made impressive progress on its chip designs, and there were reports in August that they'd successfully developed a 7nm chip, one of the most advanced designs out there. Anyway, this has provoked some anxiety in the White House, not just because the Americans like being able to use China's dependence on American semiconductor designs as leverage, but also because the foreign policy hawks in Washington see China's efforts to onshore its semiconductor industry as a precursor to an invasion of Taiwan. Essentially, they argue that China is onshoring its semiconductor industry in anticipation of US sanctions in response to a coming invasion of Taiwan. Accordingly, in 2019, after originally demanding that the Chinese actually buy more American semiconductors, the Trump administration changed tack and placed restrictions on the export of American semiconductors to Huawei, which had just been indicted by the DOJ for stealing US technology, money laundering, and helping Iran avoid sanctions involving the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. These export controls essentially prevented the sale of American technology to Chinese chip makers, but they were pretty much unsuccessful because, well, the Chinese just bought the required parts from third countries. This is why in 2020, the Trump administration introduced further export controls aimed at foreign semiconductor companies, known as Foreign Produced Direct Product, or FDP rule. FDP essentially said that any foreign company dealing with Huawei wouldn't be allowed to buy American-made technology. In his last months in office, Trump expanded these sanctions to cover a whole load of Chinese companies, including SMIC. The Biden administration has The Biden administration has apparently decided that these sanctions don't go far enough, which is why last week they introduced more export controls. Instead of targeting specific companies, these new controls ban the export of certain specialized chips and high-end manufacturing to China generally, and perhaps most significantly, they also banned American citizens from working in China's semiconductor industry. Basically, the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, otherwise known as ECRA, bans US persons from working on foreign countries' nuclear and military intelligence projects. According to last week's executive order, the White House now considers China's semiconductor industry to be part of its wider military program, which means that any US person working in the industry could face criminal penalties of up to 20 years imprisonment and up to $1 million in fines per violation. Unsurprisingly, this triggered the mass resignation of most US citizens working in China, and angry responses from both the China Semiconductor Industry Association and the Chinese government, who accused the US of tech hegemonism and violating WTO rules. To be fair to China here, these sanctions are pretty much unprecedented. Not only do they target people instead of companies, but they're also explicitly about hobbling China's technological progress, not just protecting American companies. In fact, if anything, these sanctions are bad news for American companies involved in the semiconductor industry, because most of them are exported to China. But, well, the White House has apparently decided that this is a small price to pay for national security. Now, we should say here that the impact of these sanctions is disputed. On the one hand, China has a massive pool of domestic talent to replace the Americans. China produces nearly twice as many STEM graduates as the US, and Chinese semiconductor companies have reliably outperformed expectations, despite escalating sanctions. On the other hand, these sanctions are clearly the most severe yet, and it's true that many Chinese companies did indeed rely on American executives and engineers, especially those on the cutting edge. If America can convince South Korea and Taiwan, the two other countries with domestic semiconductor expertise, to follow suit, then these sanctions could do serious damage to China's technological prospects. Nonetheless, even if the sanctions only delay China's inevitable technological rise, that might be enough for the US. As long as China isn't self-sufficient in semiconductors, then they might be deterred from invading Taiwan. China's military advantage in the Strait is expected to wane after 2027, as new US military tech comes online. So, if the US can delay China's self-sufficiency until then, that might be enough from the White House's perspective. Ultimately, this isn't going to go down well with the CCP, who will see this as proof that America aren't prepared to tolerate technological equality with China, let alone Chinese supremacy, and it's hard to see Sino-American relations improving under this administration. Ultimately, we live in an increasingly technologically complex world where things are feeling less stable, especially economically. So it would be great if politicians were better at, well, decision-making and finance. Fortunately, they could do that easily if they signed up to Brilliant, the STEM learning platform where you can learn everything from quantum computing or algebra to logical decision-making, a skill severely lacking at the moment. Their logical thinking course might start simple, but it builds, teaching you logical reasoning skills until you're solving problems which previously looked impossible. You'll get used to that empowering feeling of learning too, because this isn't just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. Using this teaching methodology, you can learn about all kinds of STEM topics. That's algebra, applied probability, calculus, gravitational physics, and even cryptocurrency. In fact, they even have a new course from Kurzgesagt, which I've got to say I found very personally exciting and spent a lot of time playing with. Anyway, if you want to learn in a more fun way, then you should sign up to Brilliant, and the link in the description will get you 20% off an annual premium subscription, which is not only a great deal, but supports the channel.